Hello, welcome to Convocation here at Berea College. I am Silas House. I'm the NEH Chair of Appalachian Studies here at the college. And first of all, I want to thank Tomas Ahrens, who is our fearless Convocation Director, who does such a great job bringing such great programming to our college. We're so thankful for his leadership. And also would like to thank Kyle Wooten, who runs the tech and makes sure that you can see and hear us properly. I am really honored and glad to be able to introduce to you my friend Margaret Renkl, who also happens to be one of my favorite writers. Margaret is the author of the beloved book Late Migrations, A Natural History of Love and Loss, which was published in July 2019. Her next book, Graceland at Last, Notes on Hope and Heartache from the American South, will be published this September. Renkl is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, where her essays appear each Monday, and they are not to be missed. She's a graduate of Auburn University and the University of South Carolina. She lives now in Nashville. Her writing has been a balm to millions of readers, particularly during the pandemic, when she supplied meditations on the natural world that go far beyond the surface into profound explorations of our humanity. Margaret is able to write about a wide range of topics, from the perfect company of a good dog to the tragic ways we devastate our own ecosystems to the hope for a new infrastructure of rail travel, all in ways that are full of hope, mystery, and nuance. I am not being hyperbolic when I tell you that she is truly one of our best writers working today. It's a real blessing to read her columns every Monday. I look forward to them like so many people do. And so, Margaret, are you in the room with us?
Um,
There you are.
but I feel
Thank
like I'm blushing.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. We're honored to have you at Berea College. You have so many fans here, and so thanks for being with us.
Thank you for taking your time to talk with me. Um, it's always just a complete honor and a pleasure to talk with you, Silas.
You too. You too. I'm sure we could talk all night, but we will rein it in for you. After about 40 minutes, I'm going to see if you all have some questions. So if you do, please enter those in the Q&A feature, and then I will read those to Margaret and let her answer those. Um, and we'll end promptly at 7 o'clock. So thank you all for being here with us tonight. But we're here to talk about the link between happiness and creativity. This is Margaret's topic for tonight that she chose. And maybe we should start out by talking about what happiness means to you as an artist, Margaret. Human history is certainly littered with stories of tortured artists and drunk poets, these stereotypes of the way we're supposed to be, right? So they don't sound like very happy people. So talk to us about that.
Well, it's true. I mean, I remember when I was teaching high school and we were studying the Romantic poets, and one of my students raised her hand and said, Miss Renkl, why are all these writers we're studying drunks or womanizers? I mean, does being a poet automatically mean that you're just kind of a person you wouldn't want to live next door to? And I think that is the stereotype, because some of our most famous artists in all genres, we think about Vincent van Gogh cutting off his own ear, and we think about Kurt Cobain, we think about all these people, not just writers, who are creative, and they seem to struggle so much with their mental health. And I think that when we say that happiness is linked to creativity, I think one thing that we have to talk about is what is really happiness. And for most people, I believe happiness, that word just conjures a kind of, we think of it as euphoria or joy, or those rare flashes of feeling that everything is right with the world, and the sun is shining and the birds are singing and the flowers are blooming. But that's not really um, what psychologists think of as happiness. For most of us, those kinds of moments that I'm talking about, the when your first child is born, when your wedding day, when when you know when you see a bald eagle catch a fish in the river, those moments are rare. They're not meant to be a permanent state. But when we talk about the link between happiness and creativity, as I understand it, the we're talking more about a sense of well-being, I think, that when, and I think most people feel this, that when you've made something, whether it's you think about all the people who took up baking bread during the pandemic, when you've made something with your own hands, whether it's, a loaf of bread, or a handmade card with some pressed flowers to send a friend, or knitting or embroidery, or writing a poem or a love letter. Those things, when they're done, you feel better somehow. It's like you have, there's just a sense of, the only phrase I can think of is well-being. You just feel better. And that state can be maintained for a lot longer, and it can be refreshed much more easily than looking for that transcendent moment of beauty or love or joy.
Yeah, I think so often some days when I just can't write, I just make a pie, or cook a meal. It's just that need to create something, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, and it can be a lot of things. I mean, I think about a couple weeks ago, I did a story for the Times about a tombstone carver who lived during the Depression here in Nashville. He was the child of enslaved people on a plantation outside Nashville, and he made his living carving tombstones. And I was talking to a historian who was showing me these tombstones at this man who became William Edmondson. He became a famous artist, a sculptor. And this historian, Betsy Phillips, was saying there's just something a little extra about these tombstones. I mean, you see one tombstone and it looks like it has little cat ears up at the corners of the tombstone, or there's a special little flourish underneath the lettering. And she said there's just something a little extra. And I think that sometimes all it takes in the form of creativity is just a little something extra, that doesn't have to be there, but gives you a sense of pleasure and accomplishment. I think about my great grandmother, who, I don't know when she left school, but she was very close to being illiterate. And so it must have been really early. But she could make the most extraordinary handmade lace. She made it with it's called tatting, and nobody does it much anymore. It's made with a little bitty shuttle, just an inch and a half long, and it takes string so thin it's like thread, and you basically just tie a series of really elaborate knots. And she sewed that tatting on every handkerchief she carried in her pocket. And it was not ever meant to be seen. It was just a little hanky that she kept in her pocket for sneezing or crying. Wasn't even the special handkerchief she carried to church on Sunday, but it was just a little extra. And I think that kind of thing can, as small as it is, can give us a lot of pleasure. Yes. And a real sense of accomplishment to do it.
Well, I think it's interesting that you've not used the word fun at all. You've used words like accomplishment, satisfaction, happiness, things like that. Often I cringe a little bit when people say to me, writing must be so much fun, because to me, fun implies a sort of lightness that writing really doesn't possess. I think writing is really hard and it's painful and sometimes it's really difficult. And I hate having to be this way and to be a writer, right? Who feels the need so deeply to do that. And so what I tell my students is that it's not so much of being fun when you're writing it, but there's this great sense of satisfaction, especially when it's over, when you have
That's what I was going
some.
to say.
Yeah.
Afterward,
Right, right.
not during the process. Well, I mean, I think it's true. I mean, it's probably more fun than digging ditches or emptying
Yes.
trash cans, but it's not why we do it.
Hmm.
And I think that it's probably not why people knit sweaters. I mean, a sweater is a very complicated,
Yes.
difficult thing to do, and you see people knitting these things that are extremely complex patterns. Just the fact of it's being a sweater is so much harder than, say, an afghan. But then you add stripes or you add elaborate cabling, and it's hard. But what it is when it's hard is absorbing.
Hmm.
And when you can surrender yourself to something, I mean, I feel the same absorption when I'm pulling weeds in my flower garden
Yes.
as I feel when I'm writing an essay for the New York Times. It's it's a way of lifting out of yourself, of putting your just everyday concerns like paying the bills or or remembering, to make that phone call that you promised to make, and it's just in the back of your mind. When you can set those things aside and turn to something that absorbs you, and where I mean, you can even get into a kind of a state of flow where you don't necessarily even register that the time is passing, even if it's
Hmm.
hard, even if it's the way writing can be sometimes very painful. It's still comforting because it takes us out of our lives. It takes us out of just whatever we're worried about or whatever
Hmm.
we're um, wanting or thinking that we need.
That reminds me of a writer that we both admire, Marilyn Robinson, who once wrote that writing is like prayer. You feel as if someone is there. And so I think that's another thing is, you don't think of prayer or meditation necessarily as fun, but it's so satisfying and it's centering and it gives you a kind of happiness that is.
Yeah, and I think that sense of centering is so
Mhm.
important too, because
Yes.
you do, especially right now, with so many claims on our time. I mean, I think about how many families I know, young families who secretly sort of miss the pandemic shutdowns because their lives got more quieter and calmer.
Hmm.
They weren't they weren't going to this lesson and that practice and that teacher conference and that doing that homework. Everything got simpler and calmer and closer, and people learned that they need that. They
Hmm.
need that centering, that feeling
Yes.
of not being scattered all over the place. Let's check this app on the phone, and let's check this email. Although I guess maybe your students probably don't check their email unless you tell them to. My husband's students, he has to text them to tell them to check their email because students don't like email anymore. But whatever, I mean, whatever the claims on their TikTok or it's you know uh, Snapchat or whatever, there's always something that is pulling here and pulling here and pulling there, and
Hmm.
anything that causes us to calm down and quiet down, is whether that's meditation or whether that's prayer, whether that's writing, or whether all of those things happen at one time. I
Hmm.
think it's healthier.
Yeah.
It's definitely happier.
When were you first aware that your own happiness was linked in some way to being creative?
um I have a brother who's a year younger than I am and a really gifted artist. And I mean, he's so gifted that it became clear that that was going to be his life's work when he was 2 years old. Before he turned 3, when I was not quite 4, and he was 2.5 or so. Some family friend gave us each a paint by number set.
Hmm.
Billy's was a clown, and mine was a ballerina. And you got to keep in mind that we were so young, we didn't know our numbers. So the idea of looking at the little chart and matching number 3 to number 3, that wasn't going to work for us. And I got frustrated really fast. And I mean, I got so frustrated that I got my pencil and I scribbled all over it. But Billy, he looked at the box on the cover on the box, the picture on the box, and he started painting his, and he got his little brush and he started, you know, shearing the colors between the lines so you didn't see the lines, just sort of feathering them in there. And it was just, my parents were dumbfounded. And I, of course, being the older sibling, was jealous. I was jealous that it was so easy for him, and I was jealous that he was getting so much attention from our parents for it. And I remember being really young and vowing that I was going to find the thing I could do like that. Like, it was clear to me I wasn't going to ever be a painter, but what could I do? I remember begging my parents for a guitar. I thought I could learn how to play the guitar. I could not, it turns out. I thought I could learn how to take pictures with in high school, I had a after school job, and I saved my money and I bought a camera. I wasn't any good at that either. I mean, I just kept, but all along, the funny thing was I was writing little stories and poems. And when I was in college, my writing teacher said something to me about, well, you were born to do this. And I remember thinking, maybe I found it. Maybe this is the thing I've spent my whole childhood and adolescence looking for. It's just arranging words on a page. I thought I was doing it because it made me feel good. Right. But that turns out to be all it takes.
Well, so often children are naturally inclined to that creativity, but it often gets erased from us. It gets pushed out of us, and they lose that joy of creating, or maybe just the confidence to try it. So, why do you think that is? What causes that?
Well, I think probably kids get busy for one thing, but somewhere along the line, and I don't know where it is, it was probably before I was born, people got the idea. It definitely was not an idea my great grandmother, the one who made the lace, ever had, but we got the idea somewhere that if people weren't paying us to do it, it wasn't real somehow. Like if you weren't selling your paintings at the mall, in the little art fair at the mall, or if you weren't selling your macrame, plant hanger at the craft fair at the park, or you didn't have your own little Etsy shop, or your own, if you weren't putting your poems in a literary magazine, that somehow doing it didn't matter otherwise. That we got the idea that being creative meant being a professional. So in that sense, you and I are not the right people to be talking about this subject, because we are professionals. But there are plenty of people who, I think about, the great poet Emily Dickinson, who all her poems, half of them were written on the backs of envelopes or shopping lists, and ended up in a drawer. I think she really desperately wanted to be published, but she wasn't. But that didn't mean she stopped writing. And there's so many people who do that, but they say things like, well, I'm not a real writer. Well, you are a real writer. If you're writing, you're a real writer. If you're painting, you're a real painter. It doesn't matter whether somebody's paying you. But I think a lot of people lose that urge to make or create because they're self-conscious about it. They think it makes them look foolish because they're amateurs. They're not getting paid to do it.
Right. This question sort of leads me to think about the similarities between losing creativity and the way that we lose empathy as we get older. You know, children are born with such a huge reserve of empathy, and then I don't know, this tough old world or what it is kind of takes more and more of that empathy away from us. But artists must really hang on to that empathy, you know, as much as we can. It's sort of, especially for writers, it's our job to put ourselves in the shoes of others, right, and see the world from their point of view. Um, and I always tell my students they really have to heighten their sense of awareness and heighten their empathy and sort of move through the world with that William Blake notion that everything that is holy, you know. And I know that I see that all the time in your writing. That concept shows up again and again. Um, but one reason that I think we lessen that empathy is because we know that too much empathy can lead to great pain and sorrow, but it can also lead to great joy as well. So, what are your thoughts on all of that, if that makes any sense?
But you know, you remind me of when my children were babies, and we'd be in Target or we'd be in the grocery store, and there would be a baby way on the other side of the store that would start crying, and then my baby that had been perfectly happy would start crying too. I mean, it is human emotional states are incredibly contagious. So if somebody's in a good mood and is cheerful and laughing, people tend to cheer up around them, and if people are gloomy and negative, then it brings other people down. I think that's just the nature of being a social species. We are it's kind of amazing. We are at the top of the food chain, and we don't have any fangs, and we don't have any fur, and we don't have any claws. The only reason that we are at the top of the food chain is because we cooperate with one another. And that's that so together we can do things. And I think that feeling of empathy, that is what makes it possible to cooperate.
Hmm.
You know, to imagine what somebody else needs, and to be able to communicate what you need and to find that common ground, that happens through empathy. And it is undeniable, in the same way that a baby hearing another baby crying is going to start crying. When you start experiencing the emotional states of other people, you are going to sometimes encounter a lot of pain. I just finished a novel. It's Richard Powers' new novel is coming out in September, and our friend Jen, you and I both, Jen Atkins Reynolds, she sent me a copy, and an early copy, and it's I knew reading the whole thing that I was going to have my heart torn out of me by the end of that novel, and in fact I did. And but what I mean, I almost practically sat there and started reading it again from page one the second I finished it, because pain is not something to avoid. If it teaches you something,
Yes.
if it creates a kind of bond, it's not all bad to know how it feels to be. It enriches your life, and in that sense, even pain can be a kind of happiness, I think.
I agree. I think more and more there's this idea that we must be happy all the time, and there's something lost in that, isn't there? When you can't just be melancholy and experience that to some degree. Um, and I'm reading that novel right now too. I'm about 50 pages in,
Well,
and
I'm
I'm
not
at
going to tell you anything else.
yeah. I know it's going to rip my heart out already. So you just confirmed what I thought. Um, well, you and I have talked before about how you stopped writing for a while,
I
and so I
did.
wondered if you would just tell the story of how you stopped writing and how you started back.
Well, it's funny. It's kind of tied to that whole question of professionalizing the creative work. Um, I had been a poet. That's what I wrote for my own self in high school and college. My graduate degree is in poetry writing. For the whole first, gosh, 12 or 14 years after grad school, I was writing only poems. And then in teaching, that's how I was making my living. And then when I had to go on bed rest when I was pregnant with my second child, and I couldn't teach. And I just kind of thought to myself, what if I started writing essays, nonfiction, about the same kind of things that I have been writing poems about? Maybe somebody pay me some money for those things and make up for this money that I was losing, not being able to teach out the rest of the year. And that was both a gift and a curse, because it turns out people would pay me for it. And it turns out I never wrote another poem. And at some point, I stopped writing what I wanted to write. And I only was writing, okay, I had to think to myself, well, is somebody going to pay me for this as a freelance writer? And if it wasn't something that there was a market for, I wasn't really going to write it. And I don't fault myself looking back for taking that attitude. I mean, we did have a mortgage, and the kids did need shoes, but it got to the point where it just wasn't any fun anymore. It just wasn't. It was just a job. It wasn't an expression of anything. It wasn't an exploration of anything. It wasn't anything I was learning from anymore. So I took a job as an editor, and for 5 years, I didn't write anything at all. And then, because that was, my kids were still at home. My mother was getting feeble and she needed to move in. We ended up moving her. She needed a lot more help. And then we ended up moving her to Nashville, and she was taking up a lot of time. And anyway, I just didn't feel guilty about it. I feel like I didn't even really feel that like I was missing anything. But I did, after my mother's sudden death, I did feel lost. Just really lost. And a friend of mine said, would you ever want to write about that? And I don't know why it hadn't crossed my mind. I don't know why it hadn't crossed my mind to just go back to writing. I didn't need to sell anything. I had a job. I didn't need to make any money from it. Why not just go back and write the kind of things that I wanted to write? I thought I might go back to writing poems, but they never did turn into poems, but they were short like poems. They just were not written in lines. But it did make me feel better. By golly, I felt a lot better after I wrote that very first one. And it reminded me what I had kind of forgotten for, I don't know, close to 20 years by then, that it doesn't have to be a way to pay the bills to be worth doing.
Right. Well, I want to make sure that you have time to read a little bit for us before we let you go. So I did ask you beforehand if you might have one of those pieces that you wrote right after you got back to writing, if you'd have one of those ready for us. Do you have?
Yeah, I
have
did.
it
I
handy?
picked one. I tried to think of one that so y'all could see what I'm talking about how I wasn't really concerned with whether anybody was going to pay me for these things. This one, I was thinking about when I started writing about my mother after she died. I got to thinking about, the more I thought about her, the more I thought about my childhood. And I thought about that line in Tolstoy about how all happy families are alike and unhappy families are the ones that aren't. They're different in their own ways. But I wanted to show a happy family that wasn't like anybody else's happy family. And I patterned it on the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. It's called the Imperfect Family Beatitudes. Blessed is the weary mother who rises before daybreak for no project or prayer book, for no reason but the solace of a sleeping house and a tepid cup of instant coffee and a fat dog curled on her lap. Hers is the fleeting kingdom of heaven. Blessed is the suburban father whose camping gear includes 200 yards of orange extension cord and a box fan, a pancake griddle, a weather radio, a miniature grainy screen TV with full-sized rabbit ears, and another box fan. He shall keep peace in the menopausal marriage. Blessed is the farm-born mother, gripped by a longing for homegrown tomatoes, who nails old roller skates to the bottom of a wooden pallet, installs barrels of soil and seeds on top, and twice a day tows it through the grass to the bright spots, following slivers of sun across the shady yard. She shall taste God. Blessed is the fatherless father who surrenders his Saturdays to paper mache models of the Saturn V rocket, or sugar cube igloos, or popsicle stick replicas of Fort Ticonderoga, and always to scale. In comforting, he shall be comforted. Blessed is the mother whose laugh is a carillon, a choir, so an intoxication filling every room in the house and every dollar movie theater and every school play performance, even when no one else gets the joke. She will be called a child of God. Blessed is the winking father who each day delivers his children to Catholic school with a kiss and the same advice: give them hell. He will be summoned to few teacher conferences. Blessed is the braless mother who arrives at the school pickup line wearing pink plastic curlers and stained house shoes, and who won't hesitate to get out of the car if she must. She will never be kept waiting. Blessed are the parents whose final words on leaving, the house, the car, the least consequential phone call, are always, I love you. They will leave behind children who are lost and still found, broken and somehow still whole.
Thank you so much. That reminds me, like all of your work does, that you always write things that just cut me to the bone, especially when you write about dogs. There's a dog in there. We love dogs, um, and but you always struck that balance where it's never sentimental. And I know that we have a lot of beginning writers, younger writers who are watching. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how do you pull that off? How do you balance dealing with these really emotional topics, yet never being sappy? It's a hard thing to
I
do.
think I'm pretty sappy sometimes, Silas. I have to admit, and I think that maybe if there is a trick to that, the answer is not to be afraid of being sappy. That the trick is always to come right up against it as close as you can without falling into the pond of just sentimentality. And sometimes you fall in and you can't help it, but it's worth the risk of falling in to get it for the times that you do get close without being quite over the edge.
Right.
And I wish I knew what the secret to that is. Sometimes I can do it and sometimes I can't do it. If there is a secret at all, I think it's in things. If your impulse is to tell us how to feel, you're almost always too close to the edge. If your impulse is to tell us what's happening, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it smells like, what it feels like. No, I don't mean emotionally, but just the tactile stuff of that experience. When you can come up with those details that bring a reader into the experience, you don't have to tell them how to feel.
Exactly.
They'll feel it.
Yeah, I always compare that to my students. I tell them that I hate it when when the music in a movie tells me how to feel. I want the
Right,
piece of,
exactly.
I want the movie to lead me there, but I don't want the music to tell me what I'm supposed to feel in that moment. So that's a
And
great
that's why I
analogy.
can't stand. My mother absolutely loved romance novels. She could not read enough of them,
Hmm.
and I couldn't stand them. And I think that's why is that the emotion is spelled out for you.
Hmm.
I want a book that'll give me room to
Yes.
find that connection myself.
And a piece of writing like that allows the reader to participate in a different way, doesn't it? Instead of just
Sure.
being an observer, you're gathering information and you become a part of it. And I think that's what sort of sets literary writing apart is
I
the real,
completely agree. I
yeah.
completely agree. The reader has a job to do.
Mm-hmm.
And there are readers who don't want to do that, and there's a good reason for those novels to exist, those romance novels or those mystery novels. I'm not in any way saying that those aren't valuable reading experiences. They take you out of your life, they help you pass the time, they might help you get past a very difficult time and give you a little bit of relief from your life. But um but but for me, what I want from a book is respect from the writer. I want the
Yes.
writer to trust me that I can get there with him or her. I'm all in.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have some questions coming in. I'm going to get to them in just a minute. So if you have one, just enter it there in the Q&A box. But before we go to that, along those same lines of striking that balance, one thing that I always think about with your writing is how you often land on a note of hope. And I said in the introduction how important your columns were to me, particularly during the pandemic. Before that too, but in a really dark time, I think that they just really were such a balm for so many people. Um, and so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about striking that balance. You are writing about pretty dark stuff, yet there's hope, there's light there. How much do you think about that when you're putting together a piece? I mean, do you want it to land on that note of hope, or do you think you're just an optimist and that's what happens, or what?
My children would laugh you out of the room if they heard you call me an optimist. I think that what I am is somebody who is constantly looking for a reason not to be in a state of despair.
Mhm.
Not so much as, okay, I don't want to depress my readers, but I don't want to be depressed. Like I want to believe that there is hope. And I guess I do in this, I am an optimist in the sense that I believe that if what you're looking for is a reason for hope, you will always find it, because we are an ingenious species. We are smart and we are empathetic and we are capable of solving immense, overwhelming problems we have in the past, and we will now, and we will in the future. I believe that. Well, I think
Yes.
a lot about, I was born in 1961. I turned 60 in October. And I think about how my parents must have felt all through the pandemic. I thought about how my parents must have felt in the 60s
Hmm.
when they were still teaching kids to hide under their little wooden desks
Mhm.
in case of a nuclear bomb attack from Russia. When, the whole society, everything that they thought they understood about how human society works, whether that was in race relations or relations between the sexes, all of that was changing.
Mhm.
And it had to have been, I don't recall them wringing their hands and worrying about nuclear war um, or riots in the streets or anything like that. But they had to have been worried about that. I mean, think about Vietnam. The very last thing they did every single night on the news was list the people who had died in Vietnam that day.
Right.
And all the kids were, I mean, a whole generation of young men getting shipped over to the other side of the world for a war nobody understood. And so I reminded myself of that. I reminded myself of how it's looked grim before. And I just fundamentally believe we're going to figure this all out.
Great. Well, I'm glad we have you out there instilling that hope in us. Well, we have a big fan of yours is Chad Berry, who's a beloved figure here at Berea College, and he wants you to know that you have a standing invitation to visit the college in person in the future. So please come back and see us.
I hope I will. I love the one time I've been to Berea. I felt kind of a little bit in love with it. I had never even heard about it. I'd never set foot in the state of Kentucky. before then, but my husband and I went up there and went camping outside Berea, and we went in all our wedding dishes came from a potter in Berea. We
Huh.
just got a little card, and we didn't register. We didn't register at the department store. We got this potter in Berea to make our wedding dishes.
Wow, that's great.
And
I'm,
they
I'm
have little
glad to hear that.
flowers around the edges.
Hmm. Well, Chad brought up an essay of yours that I actually is one of the pieces I assigned to my creative writing students today. They read it, and it's your essay "Howl," a very short essay about an old dog. And he just wanted you to talk a little bit about writing "Howl," how you wrote it, and perhaps talk about revising it in such a beautiful way.
Well, that it actually happened pretty much exactly like I describe it in the book. Our old dog, he was he was not our first dog. My husband and I had a dog before our children were born, but he was Clark, this dog in that essay, was the first dog we got as a puppy for our children. And and he was getting old. The the two oldest children in the house had already gone off to college, and one of them was on his own, and Clark was a big dog. He at his in his prime, he weighed 75 pounds. He was part shepherd, part lab, part hound. The vet called him a Tennessee brown dog. He pretty much had a little bit of everything in him. But those old dogs, those big dogs, when they get old, the vet explained to us, they feel really acutely their responsibility to protect the family. And when they start getting older, when they can't hear anymore and they don't see as well, and their body aches because of arthritis, they feel they're restless and unhappy because they know they can't do their job anymore.
Mm,
And I think smaller dogs maybe don't feel that same responsibility. But one day, it wasn't very long after Betty, we got Clark loved other dogs, and when we would go out of town, he would go stay at this farm. These two women had a farm with 40 fenced acres, and they boarded dogs when people were out of town. And Clark would be he would actually mourn when he would get home from their house. And like we would come back from out of town, it was upsetting because it was like Clark wasn't glad to see us at all. He missed his buddies on the farm. So we got another puppy a year when Clark was a year and a half old, and her name was Betty. And Betty, I remember the UPS driver was dumbfounded. He said, "You got your dog a puppy?" I said, "Well, he was lonely." He said, "But you work at home." And I said, "Well, he wanted another dog." So we got Betty. But anyway, Betty was a year and a half younger than Clark, but she got cancer when she was 12. And it wasn't very long after she died that this thing happened where Clark, my husband left the house, and Clark thought he was alone. He heard the door close, and he thought he was alone, and he didn't know his hearing was so bad he didn't know I was in the house. And I watched him from the other room do that move where he slid his back paws out from under him and slid his front paws forward and just threw his head back and just howled. It happened exactly like I described it.
yeah, I encourage everybody to read that essay. Well, I'm encourage everybody to read both of your books when the second one comes out. So right now you can get Late Migrations, and I know that Margaret would want you to try to get that from an independent bookseller if you possibly
Thank
can.
you.
So look for it. Well, we have a question from Mel Voorhees who says, "How much do you rely on writing as catharsis when times are rough? Is it your first go-to, or do you prefer to wait until you have distance from painful events?"
Um, I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, I guess a lot of what I'm writing, I have a weekly deadline for the Times. So there's
Mm,
if something is happening that is painful, but it's painful in a collective way, if it's like a pandemic or that, like, Nashville had a bombing on Christmas morning, something like that. I don't have the luxury of waiting until I
Right.
have some distance. If it's more personal rather than public, um, I guess I I kind of do both. I take notes when it's fresh, but I don't try to shape it. I don't try to give it any form. I just want enough down in a notebook that I can come back to it when I am capable of enough distance to be able to shape it, to know what to include and what to leave out. That's always the question. And when it's for me, when it's really fresh in mind, it's hard to know what I can do without,
Mhm.
and still convey what I want. So I guess the question is, am I writing it for myself or am I writing it for somebody to read? And if I'm writing it for myself, I can do it right then and there. If I want somebody to read it, I need to make sure that everything in there needs to be there, and I won't know that right off.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's something that um, a a lot of people don't realize how hard it is to write a short piece once a week. To me, to write a shorter piece like a column is incredibly hard. So I really admire your ability to be able to do that every week. It's a monumental task. I know it is. I think
It's
it's
hard, but it's not, like I said, it's not as hard as emptying trash cans. I
yes.
think that it's probably easier to do what I'm doing than to just write like the essays that are in late migrations, because
Mhm.
they are personal, and some of them pretty intense. But the stuff I'm writing for the Times, they can be personal and intense also, but they almost always start in an event, something that's actually happening. And so in a way, the world is telling me what to write. I'm
Mhm.
not having to come up with something completely out of thin air every single week.
Right. Jackie Carvey has a question. Do you have any children's or young adult books you'd suggest to help younger readers learn to trust their own intuition and think critically?
That wasn't a question I really asked myself as a young reader, and it wasn't really a question I asked of my children when I was reading to them. I I guess this is a sign of laziness on my part, but I just sort of assumed that teachers would take care of all of that. And my job was to make them learn to think of stories as a source of solace and comfort and fun. That's what I wanted for my own children. Um, Children, especially today, need to learn to think critically, because fake information is bombarding them from all sides.
Yeah.
And the ability to distinguish between something that is true and something that is patently manipulative is something everybody needs to have. But I still believe that fundamentally, what we want young children, especially elementary age, I'm thinking now, to associate with books is not judgment, but pleasure. We need them to learn to think of books as a source of great comfort and pleasure, because they will need it when they're older. And the more critical thinking kinds of reading can happen a little bit later, I think. That's just instinct. I don't know anything about educational philosophy, so I don't know that I'm right about that.
Right. Well, Portia Pennington has an interesting question. Uh, First of all, she thanks you for speaking about hope and empathy, and says that you write that brilliantly. Have you had to wrestle with jealousy of other writers, of other careers? How do you kick that to the corner, shut it up, and settle back into your own work?
I think I might have I think I might have been inclined that way when I was younger. I when I was still writing poems, I kept entering first book poetry contests and I kept losing. Sometimes I would come very close. I would be second, like first runner up. But I never won, and I never had a book of poems published. And I think I must have at some point read some of the winners and thought, well, that's not any better than I wrote. But I don't remember it very well. And now I'm just too old to care. Like professional jealousy is just completely beyond me. There's no such thing as a famous writer. When I think about how many people see every single Instagram post that Reese Witherspoon puts up there, it doesn't matter how much money you make as a writer, you don't even come close to that. Most people, when they say, oh, you're a famous writer, it's like, that's not true. Not only does nobody know who I am, nobody can even name the other people who write for the Times. So I don't know why writing for the Times would make somebody think you're famous. You're not famous. There's no fame. I don't have any professional jealousy because I don't think there's anybody to be jealous of, honestly. We're all just doing the best we can.
Well, Margaret didn't mention Reese Witherspoon, so I would say this, but one thing I didn't tell you in the introduction is that Reese Witherspoon credits Margaret with her love for books. It's one of the reasons she loves books so much, and Reese Witherspoon has done so much for literature lately. So partly due to Margaret Renkl. So thank you.
Well, that's an exaggeration on Reese's part, but yes, she was a student in my classroom many years ago,
right.
And she was a funny little thing.
We have a question from Jacob Romeo, and you talked a little bit earlier about how you don't, the world is sort of giving you your ideas for your columns and such, but he's wondering, when that doesn't happen, are there times when you struggle to come up with ideas of things to write about, if no kernels come to you for something so if that does happen, what do you do to overcome that sort of, he's not saying writer's block, but the inability to write?
I don't really ever experience writer's block. What I experience is disinclination to write. Like, I don't want to do it. It's like I wander around the house trying to think of any useful thing I could do instead and justify not writing. It's like, oh, well, I really have to write this thank you note, or I really need to unload this dishwasher. Anything really, but that's not writer's block. That's just pure laziness. I think I think I have a mortal terror at some really foundational level of running out of something to say. And because of that, I keep a running list, a really long, really long running list of things that I might want to write about. And if I read an interesting article, I save the link, and I might be able to combine it with, if it's a piece, like I one time spent 6 months saving up links to good news about the environment, just in case I ever needed a little pick me up. And I ended up writing a whole column on good news about the environment. As rare as that is, there are some encouraging things that happen. And so I just have all of these, I just have this document that it's probably 20 single space pages of notes and ideas and things, so that I can come back to it if I run out of, if I ever do come up dry. But there's some of those things that are on that list that go back 5 years, and I never have gotten to them. But I might still. I'm not letting them go. I'm not deleting them.
I think that's great advice. That's really great advice.
A lot of what happens for me, I used to have a better memory than I have now. And I could tell myself, oh, I'm going to remember that. But now I don't trust that I'm going to remember it. And I suspect I didn't remember it even when I did trust myself to do it. And so just jotting things down can really help. Sometimes I find in the notes app on my phone stuff I've dictated to myself in the car, and I forget that it's even there, much less what it says. And I think, oh, well, that's not too bad. And it ends up I wrote this piece about poetry a few weeks ago, and there's a paragraph in that essay about National Poetry Month that talks about the human need for beauty, and it comes right out of a note I dictated on my phone about people planting daffodils out in the country. Sometimes there's like the building's long since been abandoned. Sometimes the building's long since fallen down, but you can see that row of daffodils. And that was just something, I didn't even remember it. I found it when I was looking for my grocery list.
Yeah, the Notes app is a great resource for writers. I use it all the time. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. We have one more question, and we'll close with this because it sort of brings us full circle. This is from an anonymous attendee who writes, when my mom was dying of leukemia, it was so important for her to distinguish between happiness, ephemeral, and joy, more lasting, and could also coexist with sorrow. She lived with constant joy in her last year. Do you see such a distinction between happiness and joy?
I think the older I get, the more I feel the way your mother felt in her last years. I think that we all know from the time we're tiny, there's an essay in Late Migrations about when my 3-year-old learned about death for the first time. And we all know from a very early age that we aren't going to be on this earth forever. And we have to make our time here count. We have to live our lives. But I don't think that young people, as a rule, live that way. I know I've spent entirely too much time in my life just wondering about where to get the right throw pillow to put on my sofa, something stupid, completely stupid like that. But now, the older I get and the more loved ones I've buried, the more I think your mom is right, that when we do know that our time is limited, then it strikes us with so much force just how beautiful the world is and how full of love we are for the people who are in our lives and for the creatures who share our earth. And that is a kind of joy. It isn't, I don't think it's happiness in that sense that people, who are making a living advising people about how to be happy. I don't think it's that sense, but joy and sorrow are really close kin.
Yes. I think that's the perfect place for us to land and just really epitomizes what I love so much about your writing. So I can't thank you enough for being here with us tonight, Margaret, and I do hope you'll come back and see us in person. And for our final goodbye, I'm going to turn it over to our director, Tomas. So thanks again, Margaret.
Thank you, Silas, and thank you, Thomas and Kyle.
Hi, everyone. This is Thomas Ahrens. I'm the Director of Convocations, and I really look forward to reading your next column, Margaret, and your book. I can't wait. I'm still into your other book, and I'll continue that once the semester is over, I think. So I really want to thank you, Margaret, for being with us. And I can only second what Chad said. We hope to have you here on campus. It'll be a beautiful time again. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And of course, Silas, thank you so much for your kind introduction too. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And Kyle at the controls. Thank you so much, Kyle, for getting us here without anything going bad. So this is it. This concludes our 2021 Convocation series, and what a year it has been. ... We'll be back in the fall with very interesting Convo presentations and some musical performances that you'll like, I'm pretty sure. And we'll be in Phelps Stokes again. And so until then, have a great summer, everyone. Be safe, good night, and see you soon. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.